Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2020-103, incentivizing multifamily affordable and workforce housing development in transit supportive development corridors. Let's start with a roll call, please.
Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy? Ms. LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson? Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, as usual, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. So we're going to go ahead and move on to a presentation from the administration. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development, joined today with Jack Gadamus from Property Appraisal, Chris Oldenburg, also from Property Appraisal, and Bill Falsby, Municipal Manager. Also in the wings is a frequent collaborator and past consultant with the municipality, Shanna Zuspan, and we're going to walk through an explanation of the ordinance. And I will attempt to share my screen now. Okay. And make it bigger. All right. Is everybody able to see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Also want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. Kennedy. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I'll get started on AO 2020-10. Oops, I'm missing a number there. Sorry. At any rate, this is the ordinance to incentivize housing in our transit supportive development corridors and follows along with the previous incentives that we've developed and you've approved for housing here in Anchorage. Quickly, just an overview of the proposed new code additions that this ordinance would add. They are laid out in a nearly identical fashion as our previous incentive programs, particularly the Downtown Housing Incentive Program, with the format being what you see here on the screen. How it works in brief, this is very similar to, again, to the Downtown Housing Incentive, where we will allow interested parties or developers to submit applications at the beginning of a project for CFO review and provisional approval. This gives developers an opportunity to understand what benefits may or may not be granted or incentives may or may not be granted to a given project well enough in advance to help them make those financial and economic decisions on whether to go or not on certain projects. Once provisional approval is in hand, the developer is then free to build and develop the project that they have submitted to the CFO for approval. Upon completion and issuance of the certificates of occupancy, the developer comes back to the CFO for a review. The CFO and team review the certificates of occupancy to make sure that the project that was built is the project that was proposed and provisionally approved. And at that time, we'd issue a final approval, which then gets recorded. And the incentive or the tax abatement would then commence in the first calendar year after the issuance of that certificate of occupancy. Much like the Downtown Housing Incentive, the owner is required to submit annual reports to the CFO to ensure continued compliance with the terms of this incentive related to the workforce and affordable housing provisions and the number of units. And then the CFO in turn submits annual reports to the Assembly. In fact, I believe we will be developing and submitting our first annual report to the Assembly this year for the Downtown Housing Incentive. The requirements of this particular incentive are, again, targeted for a specific public policy or public outcome. This is one that's identified in the 2040 Land Use Plan, which is the adopted plan for the municipality's future growth. And in that plan, we recognize that with shrinking available land supply and population projections that are expected to grow over the next 20 years, there is a continued shortage of available housing to meet that demand. And we need to be looking at ways to incentivize and encourage additional housing development, particularly housing development that achieves higher density where appropriate. This particular ordinance then is targeted for those kinds of developments that seek to achieve a higher density, hence the multifamily requirement, and a requirement that the project satisfy 20 units or greater. Secondly, this ordinance proposes to benefit those multifamily developments that are located in what's known as a transit supportive development corridor. Again, this is a key strategy identified in the 2040 Land Use Plan that seeks to concentrate some of our population growth, our residential growth, as well as our commercial growth in those areas that are serviced by transit in order to help achieve greater density, greater usage of the available land supply in a higher efficiency development. And lastly, this ordinance requires that 40% of the units be allocated to either an affordable or workforce affordable or workforce housing types. This spectrum that I'm showing you on the screen is just to give you a sense of the different breakdowns in some of the commonly used nomenclature for defining affordable workforce housing. And what some corresponding average median income limits would be on those types of housing. And we'll be getting into more details in this on the later in the presentation. I thought I'd start with a quick explanation of why multifamily residential development is being targeted for this particular incentive, which actually feeds into why we're also looking at focusing on our transit supportive development corridors. And the answer is really, as I revealed a little bit earlier, is really in the efficiencies that are achieved in concentrating on these two types of development strategies. First, multifamily development, a development that's able to achieve higher densities per acre, typically are more efficient land use and more cost effective in the long run on a per unit or per resident basis. As we continue to see pressure on the available land here in acreage, we're going to have to identify ways to help encourage this kind of greater density where appropriate. Secondly, there's an economic reason, able to concentrate a lot of economic activity in key areas that relieves some of the pressure that could be felt for expanding commercial or economic activities into other residential areas. This helps concentrate both the users and the services of those commercial activities in the same area, could potentially lead to reductions in car trips, fewer roads needing to be built, et cetera. Locating these in transit-supported development corridors also ties into our goals to improve and increase the transit and mobility options of our residents. Not everyone uses transit today, and one of the common reasons for that is they don't live close enough to a transit line, or the transit lines don't take them to the jobs or the commercial activities they'd like to engage in. And by incentivizing this kind of development in our transit-supported development corridors, we'll be able to achieve that density that in turn further supports transit and transit's reach into the community and makes it easier for people to get around. There's affordability as well. Again, as you look at the cost of development per acre for less dense development like single-family homes compared to the costs associated with higher densities, you begin to see some efficiencies and some economics that improve. And then lastly, health. As transit-supported development corridors begin to develop We hope to see more and more of our residents relying less on the vehicle and more on walking, as well as the transit options that would come with it. The multifamily emphasis can be achieved, and we're trying to incentivize it through this tool. This is a snippet from the 2040 land use plan that looks at an overlay of both where the existing transit supportive development corridors are, as well as the multifamily zoned properties that abut those or are contained within those corridors. I just focused on the middle of the city for a couple of reasons. One, it's a good example of the preponderance of multifamily zoned property that sits within our transit supportive development corridors. It really helps emphasize how we can achieve this kind of increased density and multifamily development along those corridors. But also it showcases one of our unique districts here in town, that being the UMed district, and showcases how there are transit supportive corridors on most sides of this economic engine of the community. And a tool like this could be very beneficial to the further growth in the UMed district and all of the ancillary economic development benefits that could come from that. Why affordable or workforce housing? This one seems like a question that doesn't need to be answered. If you've lived in Anchorage long enough, you know that affordable housing is a priority for our community. We are an expensive community to live and work in. And more importantly, this is having impacts in the business community. It has long been recognized by the business community as one of the detriments to growing and attracting their workforces. Included here, I admit it's a little out of date, but from the 2019 Anchorage Chamber of Commerce Advocacy Survey, affordable housing continues to rank in the top 3. It has been in the top 3 factors that negatively affect their workforce for, I think, going on 4 years now. And it's frequently identified by other business organizations and trade groups as an impediment to their success. On the right-hand side, I wanted to showcase a snapshot of Anchorage's affordability index, I guess is one way to summarize this. The key item on this that I'd like to focus on is the percentage of renters who are overburdened. Renters that are overburdened are defined as those who are forced to spend more than a third of their paycheck on their living expenses, on their rent, and a number nearing 50% there is a little bit scary for our community. In this particular tool, who would be eligible? How would we define eligibility? Similar to the downtown housing incentive, we would target those newly constructed residential units for eligibility. In other words, somebody who purchases a hotel and converts it to apartments, they would have to be, that use would have to be converted in order for those to qualify. So they could remodel it, and it's that change of use that would change it from a commercial use to a residential use that would make it eligible. Although I think most people are envisioning new construction for this tool. This tool does not include the land in the tax abatement, nor does it include non-residential improvements. And I'll get into that a little bit here in the next few slides. This is just an example of how we would interpret eligibility versus non-eligibility. In this depiction, we're looking at a multifamily development where the entire ground floor of the space is actually commercial space. This kind of mixed-use development in a transit-supported development corridor is ideal and is likely to occur as commercial spaces typically can help offset some of the economics of the residential portions. The residential property tax abatement that we've proposed would apply to the residential improvements only. So all of the component parts of this project that were residential would be eligible. Meanwhile, the land and the commercial portions would not be. Just to put some numbers to what that may look like, we're using sort of a hypothetical example here. If a project similar to what you see on your screen was on a $500,000 piece of land and the building itself was assessed at 5.5, the full property taxes on that would be just about 100 grand per year. Of that building value, 4.5 of it would be considered residential or attributed to the residential development, and $1 million would go to the commercial. But if this tax incentive were in place, the same structure, again, would have a land value of $500,000 that they would be assessed on, but the building value would be different. So instead of a 5.5 million building value, the assessor would only assess them for the commercial or non-residential portions of that structure. And that's pretty significant. That changes the estimated taxes to about $25,000 a year. Rough math, over the 12-year period that they'd be eligible for the affordable housing exemption, that almost equals about $1 million worth of incentive. The application process for applicants, pretty straightforward and identical to the downtown housing incentive. These applications are submitted to the CFO. It contains all of the relevant information that the CFO and team will need to evaluate the application, including floor plans and square footages of the residential developments, any of the existing developments that may or may not be on the property, which portions are attributable to residential, which portions are attributable to commercial, as well as a demonstration of the increase in assessed value that's anticipated from this development or redevelopment project. And then, of course, some of the incentive-specific information that's going to be required, such as whether or not the units are being allocated to either the workforce category or the affordable category. The CFO and team, they review these preliminary applications for completeness. They verify that the application as submitted satisfies the terms of the code, and then the CFO will issue a provisional approval. And this gives a developer the degree of certainty that they need that a particular tax incentive or tax benefit could be, they're eligible for that, and allows them to complete the development work that goes into obtaining financing, et cetera. We recognize that there sometimes are changes in development plans, and certainly an applicant that has come in and submitted an application and already received provisional approval would be allowed to come back in and submit an updated application and receive updated provisional approval. The reason that's important is because the provisional approval really is the key to achieving the final approval down the road. So once the developer has provisional approval, they go forth and they do the fun stuff. They start to build. And upon completion of that construction project, they will bring their certificate of occupancy so that the CFO and team can verify that the final construction still meets what was provisionally approved and satisfies all of the terms in the code. It's the January of the first year after that certificate of occupancy is achieved, then the tax benefit begins. So those are spelled out for you below. The code proposes 12 years of tax abatement for affordable housing developments and 8 years of tax abatement for the workforce housing developments. This tax abatement or this incentive is recorded, the exemption is recorded. Of course, we keep copies here on file so that the incentive travels with the owners if a property were to change hands during that incentive period. There's an annual reporting requirement, and again, identical to what the downtown reporting requirement is. This must be filed by the owners every year by March 15th. And essentially, we're asking them to verify that the project as developed continues to satisfy the criteria that was laid out when the incentive was granted. We also ask for any changes to the structure in the time since they were approved, as well as statements of occupancy and vacancy. In turn, the CFO and team develop annual reports. We will deliver those to the Assembly. Those contain in them the a summary of all of the annual housing tax exemptions that were granted and what the value of those taxes exempted were. And that way the Assembly can keep up to speed on what's happening. The ordinance in front of you also proposes adding a line to our Title 14 fines. And this includes fines for applicants who fail to submit the annual housing exemption report. That annual report is critical to receiving the benefit of that tax abatement. So there is a fine that's being proposed to ding them 10% of the taxes exempted in the prior year for failure to file. And then, of course, the exemption granted in here, the abatement granted, would terminate if the project, say, were to change completely from say an apartment building into strictly a hotel, for example. And that is it, Mr. Chairman. We're open to questions.
Great, thank you. I already have a few folks in the queue. I'm going to go ahead and start with Mr. Weddleton.
Hi, thanks. Got a couple. So Felix, you can cut me off if I need to let other people in. So you know, one thing fairly broad is so we're doing the transit supportive corridors for this. So the question is, well, why not other places? And you know, kind of a broad scheme in our, you know, Anchors 2020 really focuses on town centers. So and you know, what we did in downtown was more kind of in line with that. It's not, you know, it's downtown, not a town center, but you know, why not focus instead on town centers? So that's, you know, one thing. And then also, you know, Girdwood has a real need for workforce housing. In fact, you know, they have a special deal to bus people in. And if you're doing a transit corridor, you know, of course they have their, you know, Glacier Valley Transit there. So they are a transit corridor. So why not add some Girdwood? And then also, and then why not everywhere? Big question.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Through the chair, I think I will start. I should have began the presentation with this, but we do anticipate that we will get a significant number of questions and comments on the ordinance, and we want to make sure that we can dedicate you know, the appropriate amount of time to addressing and answering those questions. So in anticipation of getting as many questions as Mr. Weddleton has previewed, I do think it's fair to say that we would anticipate this item on Tuesday night being continued to a later meeting, just so we can address any of the issues and questions that come out of this. In the week leading up to today's work session and in sharing this with some of our development partners in the community, we have identified there's a number of potential changes and or tweaks that may be necessary on some of the provisions. So as a preview to my answer, Mr. Weddleton, I wanted to let the body know that while we may not be able to answer and address everything today, we do want to try and get through all of the issues and questions, and that may require you know, continuing the public hearing on this item and final action to the 27th. So that's my preview of starting to answer your questions. So working through your questions, why not town centers? Town centers are an important core element of the comprehensive plan and the 2040 land use plan. And almost without exception, I'm not able to manipulate the map on the fly here, but almost without exception, the transit supportive development corridors do go through, intersect, or are adjacent to the town centers here in town. So the one snippet that I did show of the UMed district, for example, is a good example of how those transit supportive development corridors overlap a lot of the town centers that have been identified. So in some ways, I think we are accomplishing that goal. Now, there is an exception. Of course, most of the exceptions to the rule will fall in your district. So the Girdwood example of the transit supportive development corridor is one way in which Girdwood, I think, deserves a closer look, but also South Anchorage, which in its current iteration is not serviced by transit in the same degree as it used to be, for example. So I think the long-winded answer to your question, Mr. Weddleton, is that we mostly hit the town centers. There could be some that are missed, and that's something that we'd want to revisit as we look at any possible tweaks or changes to this. The second question you asked, if I got it right, is just to paraphrase, is, well, why not just multifamily development everywhere? And I think that's a fair question to ask. I mean, we all know and have heard that the economics on multifamily development are extremely tough in this community. The cost of building, the cost of construction compared to the rents, it just doesn't always pencil out. And so why not just make this a broad multifamily development tool? And I think the answer to that is that we look at the use of incentives not just as something to facilitate the production of widgets, but to facilitate the production of widgets that are identified, that contain within them other identified priorities of the community. And so looking to the 2040 land use plan, which laid out a number of community goals and objectives, we were trying to identify ways that we can achieve the vision of that plan as well as incentivize additional housing. And a key component of that is to help increase the density in and around our transit corridors and try and target multifamily development in those areas. So in the same way that we singled out downtown in the initial tax incentive that came before you a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, this is the second targeted incentive designed to achieve a public policy goal beyond just incentivizing production of the widgets. And I'm sorry, I think I missed your third.
I think that was broadly it. Just kind of looking why the corridors was broadly it. So I think you covered everything. I have other questions. You want to go around to others, Felix, or?
You can go ahead and do one more, and then I'll put you back in the queue, Mr. Weddleton. Okay,
I didn't go look at the details, but we have the community workforce agreement thing triggers at $4.5 million, and in your example, it was a $5.5 million project. Would this trigger community workforce agreement? Because I think that's at any time the city's involved. So it called in that Tudor Elmore development because I think there are incentives and so on. So anyway, does this trigger community workforce agreement?
I'm going to phone a friend on this one and ask Mr. Falsey to chime in, but I believe the answer is no. Bill, are you online?
Yes, ma'am. I'm listening in the shadows as my computer is starting to break down. I will confess that is a question that had not previously occurred to me, so I would be giving you some extemporaneous legal interpretation. And so maybe what I'll do is to say, that's a good one. We'll put that on the pile and refer that to legal for the definitive answer. But I believe you're right, Mr. Wendleton, that the ordinance was written such that the contribution was over 3.5. But we will take a look at that.
And I'll add that in the hypothetical example that I gave Mr. Weddleton, while the total value of the property as assessed by Jack and his team was $5 million, the quote unquote contribution by the municipality in the form of the incentive was under $1 million. But as Bill said, we'll dig into it some more.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I saw the slide where we indicated that you could change a hotel into residential, but you couldn't basically revitalize existing residential and still get this credit. And there really wasn't much of an explanation of why that was the choice made. And my concern is, I guess I want to know why, or a little bit more about why, because new construction is one, really hard to pencil and make work. And I know that's one of the reasons for the incentives. And two, we do have along these transit corridors, maybe not fantastic, but high density housing stock that could possibly be revitalized if there was adequate incentive. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So through the chair, this is a tool designed to increase residential, and it does have I didn't go over, I apologize for not going over this specifically. It does have a requirement that an eligible project increase the housing stock by a minimum of 20 units. And so in the example, I think that you're describing where it's a renovation project, not necessarily an addition, renovating an existing housing stock does not necessarily add new housing stock. But in the case of a hotel, let's say it's a 20-room hotel that's converted to now a 20-room apartment building, that would technically increase the housing stock. It goes from commercial space to residential space. Now, there could be an example where a renovation and addition project satisfies the criteria laid out. So if it's 20 units that get renovated, but then 20 additional units get built on, that would qualify. But the overall intent is to increase housing stock. So renovation alone would not satisfy the criteria.
Thank you. Next, I have Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris, I have quite a few questions, some of which originated from a conversation I had with Tyler Robinson, who's on the phone. And so I'll just list them out to you, and then you can answer the ones you want to now, knowing that you plan to kind of work through this a little more. So we received some emails, I think from Shanna, is it, and also Sean Debenham about the 12-year period. So if either now or later you could speak to why 12 years and how you came to that. I think Tyler had some concerns that the way eligibility is defined would exclude certain types of affordable housing that we might actually want to include. And so I might let him speak to that if that's okay. Why 20 units? And then do we want 20 units on a particular parcel, which is, I think, the way the language is crafted. Tyler pointed out that, which makes sense to me, that, you know, you might not be on one parcel, you might be working on 3 parcels and have it span across those boundaries. So considering that, and then I might ask Tyler to speak to just the definition of affordable rents and whether that makes sense. Thank you. And also, thank you for bringing this. I mean, you and I and Michelle talked about this, I think, 6 months ago. So, and Sean Debenham as well. So I know that you've been working on this for a while, and I definitely support it.
Thank you. So I'll kick it off through the chair, Assemblymember Quinn Davidson. Good questions. Most of that is, I think, asking for Tyler to clarify some of his points. But I will introduce Tyler by saying that we have been talking to Cook Inlet Housing, and we recognize that there are some specific development conditions that may or may not fit within the current parameters of the ordinance. So in some of those gray areas, that's where we feel that this ordinance could use a little bit more time. Hence our request that this be continued to a later meeting. But yeah, you raised some good questions about a project that spans multiple parcels and how that would be evaluated, as well as the metrics or the criteria that we're using for defining affordability. And Tyler, I'll let you chime in if you'd like to sort of cover those topics. I think you have to hit.
Tyler, yeah, go ahead. Hit star.
Can you hear me?
Correct. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Thanks. Appreciate it. And through the chair, I mean, I'll let you all continue the conversation about the number of parcels. Again, it's a pretty common situation for us to have what we would consider one project, if you will. It might be a 50-unit project across parcels. So would like clarity on that. And, you know, just to say, even if you're building an 8-plex, for example, you're still dealing with a considerable gap given the requirements to build that smaller multifamily housing. So I think that point's been made. The one that I really wanted to just sort of make is the issue of how we define affordable rents. And so the ordinance, you know, defines this sort of 2 tiers of one, affordable housing units and workforce housing units. And I think most of you know that, you know, a workforce unit is something that is very clearly defined community by community. So there's no sort of federal definition of workforce. Different communities will define what their targets for workforce housing is. And basically it's a category of housing that is not otherwise, you know, where there's not otherwise existing federal or state funds often to help subsidize that housing to offer them at lower rents. And so it's up to each community to define what those are. I think that's what this ordinance is trying to do for the workforce units. For the affordable units, the definition, the derivation of rents as a function, and there's quite a bit in the ordinance of kind of how that was gone through. But I would simply say that as it's currently written, the rent levels that are defined as affordable are inconsistent with what is otherwise defined as affordable in our state and federal programs. And so I think if the intent is to actually recognize and incentivize those types of units along transit corridors, I think we could come up with some language that really defers to those other programmatic definitions. And so, for example, when I look at typical product that we do that might even be 100% affordable under the definition of the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a federal program, the rents that are proposed in this ordinance are in some cases quite a bit lower or low enough that it would be unlikely that this tool would be utilized, certainly by us, or I would wager by anybody else doing that type of product. And if you're not then able to qualify those types of projects, I would think you wouldn't get a whole lot of applications under the affordable housing provision. So I'm happy to kind of answer additional questions on that, or continue to work with Chris and the administration on, what would sort of how we would describe it that would work better. But I just wanted to point out that that inconsistency. Thank you.
And if I may, I'll conclude, Mr. Chairman. One of the key issues in the difference between the definitions is whether you're looking at what we've proposed, which is the HUD FMR or fair market rents determination versus what Tyler essentially was describing, an AMI or average median income approach. If the group is interested in sort of an overview of those two measures and how they work and why they're different, I would invite Shanna Zuspin to chime in. And Shanna, you're on mute if you're talking.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Yeah, just the fair market rents are meant to reflect kind of more the overall sort of average market rents for a particular area, and HUD uses them as a proxy to estimate the housing vouchers that are available to, Section 8 housing programs. So a household would essentially pay 30% of their income, and the difference between that and the fair market rents is what the voucher is used for. So it's really meant to target sort of what's a fair rent in a particular region, whereas the income limits that are used to sort of justify and allow occupancy into different affordable housing programs are based on the household's income. Is that the right question, Chris?
It is. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
And just in closing, Mr. Chairman, Assemblymember Quinn Davidson, these are the kinds of conversations that we've been having and looking at this ordinance as a tool. Our goal being to make sure that this tool is as flexible as possible for as many development types. Not every development follows the same development financing that Tyler's do, but we want to support all of them equally. So this is one of the areas that we think we want to spend more time with. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have any other follow-up, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief just because I know there are others in the queue. Thanks, Chris, Tyler, Shanna. That's all super helpful. Chris, two of the questions I raised, which if we don't have time now and we want to pump them, that's okay, but are why the 12-year period and why the 20-unit minimum? So you could take those now, or we can wait if we want to get to other folks' questions, but I want to make sure those were in there.
Yes, thank you. So both are good questions. The short answer on the duration of the incentives is that these are some of our best calculations based on some pro formas that some hypothetical pro formas that we worked on with Shanna in the fall. They are not an exact science. Every project is different and distinct. So I will acknowledge that 12 years pencils on paper for hypothetical projects, it may not work for every real world project that's out there. But that was our starting place. And then secondly, on the minimum number of units, my recollection is that 20 is a minimum amount of residential development that we would be able to achieve on these multi-family zoned properties. In other words, there are minimum density requirements that have to be met.
Thank you. All right, next I have Mr. Dunbar. You made a comment in the chat.
Oh, no, that was just about the overlap between the transit-supported corridors and the town centers. And I was noting that Muldoon and Dunbar is represented here.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thank you. So Mr. Welton's question about the town centers versus the transit supportive development corridors. I think, John, you referred to the 2020 land use plan, but I believe in the 2040 land use plan map and process, they clearly identified the transit supportive development corridors and as opportunity for this exact kind of thing. So I just wanted to suggest that even though there is this idea of let's do it around the town centers, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we had lots of discussion collectively as that plan, the 2040, was moving forward about these corridors. I know in Fairview, we talked about it a great deal.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks. Yeah, and I understand that, Mr. Constant. I just, but we don't want to neglect the town center notion either. That's why I brought that up.
Roger,
I think
thanks.
a point actually on affordable housing definition, and the definition on page 8 doesn't matter. Doesn't match the definition page 4 of the AM. One's on median income and the other one's fair market rent, but you're going to work on that anyway. Sorry, so what was going through my list? You know, it seems a couple things just odd. You have on the whereases. Sorry, flipping back here. Apologize. The last whereas says that this could be repealed through referendum. Well, that's true for any AO. Why call that out here?
Mr. Chair, I can answer that one to Assemblymember Weddleton. That is an oddity that is forced upon us by the state statute that governs our ability to grant the tax exemptions. The state statute that now allows us to do the economic development tax incentives has a requirement that we're supposed to say in the authorizing ordinance explicitly that it can be repealed by voters.
Oh, okay. Okay, is there any minimum unit size? And I would say that broadly, just from education. What's the smallest allowable residential unit that we're allowed to build in Anchorage?
Through the chair, very good question. The answer is yes, there's a minimum size, and I am going to have to get back to you on the actual number, the square footage, after I'm able to phone a friend in the building code department.
Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you. That's it for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So then next I have a comment from Mr. Falsey in the chat. Mr. Falsey?
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was going to say, back on the question of the community workforce agreement, I previously indicated that I thought it might. On a quick skim, I think I will revise that answer to say I think it probably wouldn't, but again, we'll refer it to the law department. The code says a qualifying project shall be a municipal construction project, whether for renovation, new construction, expansion, or demolition, in which the costs are estimated to exceed 3.5. Cost, I don't believe, is expressly defined elsewhere, but I think it would be a rare project where even if you considered the tax incentive investment to be a qualifying cost, and even if you consider these private projects to be municipal construction projects, that you'd hit that threshold. But it's again, that was just a bit of a do-over on the earlier answer.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. Are there any further questions or discussion? All right, not seeing anything then. Thank you, Mr. Schutte and others for the presentation and the answers. So looking forward to Tuesday and likely postponing this item to a future meeting, and we will see if we need to do another work session to continue considering this ordinance. Mr. Schutte, you had additional comments?
Yes, thank you. Just in closing, we definitely would appreciate that. In addition, as members develop questions or comments related to this in the interim, please be sure to get those to me so that we can take those into consideration as we look at any additional changes or amendments that could be required. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn-Davidson?
I was just going to bring up the, what I bring up every time, Chris is going to love this, the reinvestment focus areas and just how those are going. I know that that was planned for Spenard. Obviously, a lot of this would work in the Spenard area as well. How does it relate, not relate, provide joint benefit, and what's the status of those?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, Assemblymember Quinn-Davidson. So this is a component part of what a reinvestment focus area will do. And so, for example, one of the areas in your district, the Central Spenard area that you recently approved as a deteriorated area, that is one of the first RFAs or reinvestment focus areas identified in the 2040 Land Use Plan. The component parts of those reinvestment focus areas include executing on the tools available, as well as developing new tools that help further incentivize and achieve the redevelopment goals of the RFAs. So this particular ordinance is a component part of realizing the objectives of those RFAs. So it's related to it in that sense, that it's a tool that is part of the RFA package. The RFA ordinance designating the RFAs is still under construction, and I would anticipate that that will be on its way through the planning and zoning process this fall. And if I had to guess, it would be in front of you all in the spring of 21. But in the meantime, tools like this, the deteriorated designation, some of the capital projects that are occurring, for example, in the Central Spenard area and others, these are all component parts that ultimately support and help us realize and achieve the goals of the RFA.
Thank you. So before I close off this work session, just want to note for the record, so Mr. Falsey has put in the chat a copy of Alaska statute, and I actually think you might have gotten the statute wrong. I think that's, at least according to the whereas in the ordinance, 29.45.050, M, which that is the statute which pertains to the requirement to put it out there that this may be repealed by the voters through referendum. So if anyone's interested, you could look up that statute. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this work session, and we will see each other again at 12 noon. Thanks, everyone.